Well, as promised on the last show, I think it did get worse before it got better, but at least this is a different setup than than what I had last time, and it's more controlled. There's more to be done.
Do you have anything on your mind to talk about? Because I don't really have anything surfacing too much.
Well, one of the things that we talked about last week, sort of in passing, that seemed to be a place where you had some, call it underlying passion,
You're
was
so nice.
when you said something about let's just do a little baby brand refresh, and that seemed to uh, set something from simmer to almost a full boil. So I was just, why do you think that's a thing in the client world? Like, why is there so much fear about even what we call it? When it's time to, there's something that's not lining up. I mean, nobody does a rebrand or nobody goes into a branding exercise because everything's great. So something is clearly off at a baseline. So like, why do you think corporations have such a hard time, leadership ultimately, not the LLC paperwork, but the people
Sure.
have a hard time getting around that fear? What is that?
So I think to uh, this is off to a great start. I think the best way to maybe frame this, you've already answered it. A mini brand refresh, just a light refresh. All those terminologies they're the easy button. They're the easy way out.
Yeah.
They are the thing that corporations love to do, which is to pay lip service to action
Mm-hmm.
and pretend that that's going to actually impact something down the line.
Mm.
But it's ultimately completely risk averse and safe, but it says it is something they can look at and go, but we did this. And my mind immediately went to like a car that is just completely not functioning, like maybe a race car or something, right? But you decide like, we're going to get a whole new set of decals put on the outside that makes this look like the hottest new car that is on the racetrack. And yet the thing is like smoking and falling apart on the inside. It is so much easier to put a new wrap on it than to face the hard truths that what we're building isn't working. So I think that's really the answer to your question.
Reminds me of the old internet. It was probably pre-YouTube. Some Australian guys being interviewed about what happened wrong with this cargo ship, and he's like, "Well, the front fell off."
Well, because the front fell off and 20,000 tonnes of crude oil spilled into the sea caught fire. It's a bit of a giveaway. I just like to make the point that that is not normal.
We'll have to put a link to that.
I am imagining it coming from an
It is
Aussie's
one of my
mouth, and I
favorite
can
because
totally.
it's like so British deadpan. Like, and what would you imagine was the cause of the thing? Well, clearly the front fell off.
Yeah.
It's not supposed to do that by all means.
Yeah.
But that's like
Yeah.
where most people are with brands. Like, well, something is clearly wrong, but also they're so dismissive about doing the right thing to fix it.
I think that it's this fundamental separation too between this idea of what is it that we portray ourselves to be versus what we really are. And I talk a lot about that when it comes to brand and branding and brand strategy, which I kind of all lump together in one big pool.
Mm-hmm.
That it is very difficult to look yourself in the mirror and say, my life is starting to go off the rails and it's my fault. That's really hard to do, right?
Right.
I mean, most of us either bury our heads in the sand, blame other people, soothe it some other way. Well, corporations are people. They're made up of people. They're doing the exact same thing on the corporate level, except they're under a microscope and they have investors and they have customers and they have audiences. So you're just turning that dial up to 11 and now you're watching human nature play out. And it's just so difficult, especially the publicly traded companies, man. That's where you see it the most. The conservatism and the sort of Me Too, like lemmingism. I call it corporatism. I mean, that is the word that I actually use for that, is this idea of it's like a dominoes effect, when the first person does it, suddenly now every other corporation gets in line with it because they know the power of the public's perception and what's going to happen when they become the target of some, social media ire and it gets on the front page of wherever. So you go into safety mode, spin mode with the PR campaigns. You just constantly are like in a defensive position to protect wherever you are now that feels safe. And that's what ultimately, when you have investors who are just hoping that you can generate an 8% return or more over time, that's all just going to lead to the lowest common denominator of risk aversion. So that's what I think we're seeing when people open up the brand conversation. It's very difficult because a legitimate brand strategist, a legitimate brand team member or partner is going to come in and say, we have to ask these difficult questions. We can't gloss over this. We can't just put some pretty words and, pictures together and videos and make everybody feel good. And then they'll forget about the fundamental, freaking miscarriages of our business that can't provide what we say it can provide. Who wants to do that?
Yeah, totally. This is top of mind. I just finished longtime listeners of any podcast I've ever been on. I've been talking about doing the audiobook version of my book, Bold Brand 2.0, for years, literally for years. The reason I have a second version of the book is because I was recording the audio for the first version of the book. And I was like, oh, that needs updated and this needs changed and this and this and this. And so that's what led to rewriting the book and doing version 2. And then I thought I'll immediately do the audiobook version because I was really excited about that. Well, apparently not excited enough to get it done. But I just wrapped up the recording sessions for that this week. So that feels like a big win. I'm pretty excited. So that's officially off to the editor and getting done. I decided the last thing I need to do is also put the editing on my plate. But all of the process things, like the stuff that I've been talking about for, almost 20 years at this point around branding, it just reminds me, all reading my own words and my own advice to would-be businesses who are considering a brand undertaking of some sort, whether it's a new brand or rebrand. All of that stuff is just so fresh in my mind at this point. And one of the things that one of the last chapters is talking about, what to do when your brand starts to feel stale. In my experience, for the in-house marketing team or the leadership or people who are looking at the brand every single day and they're trying to figure out how to make it work, it happens really quickly internally. It's like 90 days, 6 months, a year, 18 months in, they're going, what can we do to make it feel fresh? What can we do to like shake it up and, make it pop and do all of all
You're
of
freaking
those
me out with those words, man.
snazzy words that marketers use about what to do with their brand. But it is wild to me how quickly we get like numb and bored with our own brand on the corporate side. Meanwhile, nobody on the outside has probably even really noticed fully what has changed and what is different. So, I mean, what do you do with that when a company is, or an individual for that matter is like bored with their own brand?
You bring up a lot here. This is great. It's funny because I immediately think of a couple different things. One of which is part of what I've coined my Torrey's 10 rules of branding, which I've been dialing in, and I have finalized that'll be public soon. But the 10th rule is
And are these immutable rules?
Shout out to
that might be trademarked.
And yeah, but I feel like that's probably not the right way to go.
Right.
They might be a little mutable. I don't know, maybe. I don't know what that means, but yeah, the rule 10 is that brands are living creatures. And I mean that. And what you reminded me of here is relationships, and which is a vital and critical component of a powerful and strong brand. And you think about this in our, again, extension to the human condition. And I might want to earmark that because I've been thinking a lot about that. The branding is really just an understanding of the human condition. I mean, it's really, at the end of the day, that is exactly what we're doing, is we're understanding how humans work, how they operate, and what happens on their own, what happens when they're in groups, what happens when they're influenced, all of the different things that make humans human. That is what branding, brand strategy, that is what all of these are about. 100% clarity on the humans that we're dealing with. And this is why so few, again, these massive corporations who have lost connection and lost touch with the human that's involved, where everybody is just a number to them, except for their largest, investors, basically. When you get to that size, you see it. It's its worst. And then you think about the countless small businesses who deal with their customers every single day. And they have stronger brands inside of their own communities with no graphics, crappy logos, but they have a strong brand because they have that human connection. And that's what we're desperate for. And humans, there's one thing that humans are really good at. It's sniffing out inauthentic experiences and messages, things that are very clearly driven to benefit me and not you. We're very good at kind of sniffing those things out. And that's what, again, that's where we get into like really great marketing and really great spinsters and all these people who think that they can outrun that. But when we talk about human relationships and you talk about kind of growing stale, again, we see this all the time in our own friendships, marriages, relationships, where over time things start to feel familiar, and familiarity brings comfort, but comfort also brings boredom. And that's something that we have to pay a lot of attention to, because it will literally simmer in the background without us noticing it until the heat has become so unbearable that one person goes, I can't take this anymore. This is ridiculous. And in the business world, what that means is they've had enough of your product's crap or boredom or whatever it is, and they go to a competitor. It's not nearly as bad as, it breaking up a relationship.
Had enough of your cold French fries. I'm out.
Yes, exactly. Your competitor is advertising for months now that the French fries are awesome, and 3 friends have told me so. I'm going to them now, right? Yeah, I think that the answer to this and the key to this, you've picked on 2 things that I think are critical. One is to actually understand from the beginning what you're actually doing in business and what it means to actually build what I would call a brand-centric business. First of all, you're never going to escape the concept of brand. It is how the people feel about you after interacting with you or hearing your message. You can never escape that. I don't care how single-celled that is, all the way to like a fully developed blue whale of a brand. I don't care. Like, you can't escape the concept of it.
Right.
And once you start to realize that and say, okay, now we want to make sure that, in my opinion, we're speaking powerful truth to what we do, right? It's not enough to speak just the truth. You want that truth to be powerful and resonant to people. So when we do that, that is the act of brand, and branding is, in my opinion, speaking powerful truth, because you want them to then, you do want influence over their gut reaction, which is where their brand lives, right? That's where the brand lives, is in the gut reaction of your audience. So you do have influence over this. And when you allow that to get out in front of you and you allow that to get too far away and you haven't done anything to nurture that and to care for that and to, at the end of the day, value it, that this is part of the problem. This is why I have an issue with this concept, even of the word rebrand is problematic to me, because it's never a rebrand. It's always the step that you're taking the day after the step you took yesterday, every single time. Perhaps you have a radical step sometimes. Most of the time you don't. It's all just an extension of what you've been building, the context that you have been building this whole time in your audience. And you can throw it completely out and start over, or you can take incremental steps and everything in between, but it's all you. So I think that when we talk about the relationships and the growing stale, I'll have to try to recall exactly how you framed your question. You might have to ask it to me, but that's what
your
I'm reminding
story
of.
is so good that I've lost track of what my question was to start with. But
look at that.
You were talking about the relationship thing, the human element of it. And like we talked a couple episodes ago, that first trademark was for Bass Ale, and it wasn't to protect their IP. It wasn't about like making sure nobody stole their logo. It was about making sure that someone who bought Bass Ale 2 villages over was still getting a Bass Ale. It was about protecting a consumer. And it's interesting how distant companies get from that it's the legal thing and it's the corporate thing and it's the value of the brand. And it's, they lose sight of how much the brand really is for the consumer and the relationship that you have from the people who buy from you.
Yeah, man. Without that relationship, the brand's value is literally nothing.
Yeah.
You're, even if we're talking about commodity level, the value is literally nothing. And that is obviously not the goal. And we shifted away a long time ago from consumers asking, what does it do? Where, you're like Sears robot catalog of 1897 and you're like, I need a new, saw to cut something down. And I see that this steel is, superior to all other steel or something. So that means that I am less sore after sawing wood, right? I mean, like the feature set, what does it do, was critical back then. But now it's, what does it say about me? Right? It's all about your identity and who you align with and what it says to have Nikes instead of Asics or whatever other brand. That's a critical shift. And so that's companies need to understand that that's what humans are looking for now. And that means relationships and the value that we exchange goes beyond just the products themselves. Like it has to mean something beyond that. And so that's what we've seen over, 150 years or whatever transition.
Yeah.
That puts the emphasis on the relationship as much as the product. And that's difficult for a lot of business leaders to kind of quantify because they want data, they want numbers, they want figures, they want defensibility. They don't like this world of how do people feel about us? What is the emotional trigger? What's the relationships value? They don't like those terms because those are, again, not because they don't see the value in them. It's because they have difficult metrics to quantify because the market has demanded that, right? Especially publicly traded companies. So the language has had to shift here to things like brand equity, brand value, so that we can connect these to metrics and go, no, these actually do have quantifiable, measurable differences in your, overall revenue. And it's difficult to quantify that. I actually push back on that with my clients a little bit often because there are certain elements of the human condition that I'm sorry, you just can't put in a vial and measure. You just have to trust the process of what you're trying to push and then reap the benefits later.
Well, when you talk about quantifiable, measurable differences too, when you are trying to uniquely stand out, there's a little bit of a paradox of like, you're selling drill bits and you want to look and sound like a brand that is selling drill bits, but you also want to look and sound differently than all the other drill bits. So there's a little bit of that. How much discomfort can you create to disrupt or to stand out or to be unique in the market while still looking like you belong in the market, which is a pretty tricky dance.
Yes, it is. It's that frame of mind question. So we've got that general to specific way of understanding a brand, right? When they're first introduced to it. If you say, for example, I love this drill bit analogy because who was it? Was it Seth who said, that people don't want a drill bit, they want a hole?
They don't buy 16-inch drill bits. They buy 16-inch or quarter-inch, 16th-inch holes,
right?
Which really
exactly.
they're buying the thing they want on the wall.
Exactly. That's where I was going to go with
the room is what they actually want.
That's exactly it. So if we pulled that thread long enough to be like every, brand strategist and marketer's pipe dream of like, I want to advertise that what we really sell is, closer marriages. And you're like, what? We're drill bit company. Well, but hear me out. You want the whole, right? That's really what they want. And the guy's like, well, yeah, that's a good point. I can see that. You really want the whole, but then what do you do with that hole? Well, you make, so the screw can put the shelf on the wall. Okay, so we sell shelves on walls? Well, no, hear me out. We sell the family picture or the wedding picture that goes on the shelf. And so in our commercial, you see the people on the couch and the fireplace and they're watching TV and they're snuggly and the photo is over there on the shelf. And then we talk about how the drill bit made that happen. It's like you get to a point where you're like, so we sell relationships? What? I thought we were a drill bit company. You do get these
and in the photo, the wife is like, and I told you not to wear that shirt. And he's like, and I hated that haircut. And so you're really selling a fight.
Yeah, that is so cynical. Anyway, yeah, I mean, that's where we have to be careful to stay within the realm of the actual, commodity and the usage of any particular product, right? Or service. You do see people go off the rails like this, especially in, things like insurance or, big, just kind of ubiquitous products where there's not a lot of options and there's these massive megacorps. Like they kind of can just start going crazy with it when you're at the end of the day, you're like, hey, what does it cost and what do I get?
Right.
And, basically, spoiler alert, they're going to screw you no matter how they can, because that's just how that product works. But the advertising looks great.
It was like the late 80s, early 90s, like advertisers finally surrendered to this. So like if you watched a cologne or a denim commercial on MTV, you'd get to the end of it. And before you saw the logo, you're like, I don't know what this is for.
This is an excellent point.
These ethereal, totally mood, totally like, loosely lifestyle driven ads. And then you'd get a Chanel logo or a Levi's logo or a whatever at the end. And it was like, that became like fodder for Saturday Night Live and sketch comedy and all these other things too. Like these fake ads, because you would never know what it was for. So it was interesting to at least see brands go, yeah, we can just do whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I loved watching that, and you're right. It was right in that time frame. And so in the advertising world, you saw this. You moved from those classic old ads where you would have like the black and white newspaper ad, and you'd see the product really big in the center, and then there'd be like 4 columns of type down below that were like this novel. And
Oh,
my
right.
copywriter friends love that. They see it and they're like, that's where they come from. It's like the
Like the
Eugene
boy in the
Schwartz, like
train car ad, or, it's all of
yeah,
these
or
really
Porsche, or
classic.
like, yeah, you think of these like, very common, structures for ads. And it's like the copy, you sat and you read the copy for, 60 seconds, and you were just moved to buy because I don't know, apparently humans had patience back then. And then these ads, like you're talking about, I love the example of like the Nike ads when they came out, and it was literally a picture of somebody out getting after it, sweaty with the shoe, and it was a Nike logo. This was even pre URLs, like there was no
Mm,
like
right.
Nike.com or anything. It was
Just
literally a
do it.
Nike
Like
logo. Yes, and
that was the URL.
that was the
There was no
extent
URL.
to the type on the whole thing. And the copywriter community in the advertising world, of course, like what is happening here, right? Like, because to them, their whole value went out the window, when in fact, what they should have understood, and what the best ones understood, was no, what this means is your copy just doesn't see the light of day. Your copy is often just feeding into the concept of what makes that ad ultimately work. We still have to pin the details perfectly, but then we move and shift that copy over to the second layer, which is after they are actually convinced that that's the thing I want to align with. Then I further justify that with my logic later, right?
Yeah,
Which is
for
a
sure.
fundamentally different message than what they used to write. And there's a whole thing about that. Anyway, I won't get into that right now. But like the point is, yes. And I think this is an extension of that shift away from the consumer asking what it does to what it means. And in between, we sort of had this, what is it? Uh, I think it was Seth who also talked about this. So I don't know why we're bringing up Mr. Seth Godin, who we love and admire. Just shout out
Just
Seth.
just rehashing Seth Godin books.
Yeah, I don't know why. Well, it's probably because he's spoken about everything in every single way to a T. He's the guy who I agree with across the board more than any other individual. So again, shout out to the OG. But um, the shift is something like, what does it do to what does it mean to what does it say about me? As you move down the
Sure.
sort of like, arc of how humans interact with products.
Yeah.
And that was in that transition sort of from, what does it mean to what does it say about me? We were watching that sort of happen, and all the media changed too. I mean, the internet started being a thing, larger TVs were more of a thing, publications and newspapers and magazines and, all of those things were kind of different. Now we don't even have them. So yeah, it's really interesting to watch that. But thinking through all of those different tactics, I mean, what we're really speaking about is just how did the top brands leverage actual legitimate real brand building to connect with humans where they are in that moment.
Hmm.
We're in a very interesting moment now, to say the least, when it comes to that.
Yeah. How many magazines each month did you receive as a teen or a college student?
That's a good question. I think what I had in the like when I still lived at my parents' house, I know at one point I had Spin magazine.
Hmm.
I would have had, what was the other? There was the other alternative music. It wasn't Rolling Stone, but it was the darn it, I'm not going to remember it. But it was another alternative music
Right.
publication. Can't remember it. Um, Younger, I had motocross magazines. Those were
Uh-huh.
fantastic. Those are the ones that pop off to my head. And then later, Com Arts, wallpaper, print, how, those
Hmm.
definitely in the design world. What about you? What did you have like pre-college?
Yeah, most of those. Spin was definitely one of them. There was another, like, it was Details. It was like a GQ wannabe, like a younger version. And it had like some fashion and music stuff in it. Um yeah, and definitely once I was a homeowner, then it like got into some home decor stuff too. And of course all the same graphic design things, but like
Mhm.
um Dwell
Like Dwell.
magazine, and
Yeah.
yeah, and some of those others. But it's just wild. Like I at any given month, especially after uh being out of college, I probably had something like 4 to 6 different magazine subscriptions that I would always look at that media. And it's interesting now how all of our media is digital effectively
Hmm.
at this point, and you don't have like one supplier of the story that's getting all the ad revenue from that thing, in the same way that a magazine or a television station would. Now it's like all YouTube or Instagram or whatever. So like they've become the Uber, the Uber medium, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. What was your all-time favorite magazine?
Oh, all-time favorite magazine? Oh, this is really deep cut. It's super nerdy. Like in high school, I had a subscription to a magazine called Airbrush Action. This is like, uh,
Wow.
yeah, and it is what it sounds like. It was fine art for airbrush and like tips and techniques and highlighting upcoming artists, and Photoshop effectively killed that art, but I was really into it.
I'm glad I asked.
That's
I
is that
had
a
I
shocker?
would not unexpected, I would say. I think my all-time was wallpaper.
Yeah.
Wallpaper was brilliant. I mean, just as a person who wanted to understand pure culture, design, and human condition wrapped into
Hmm.
one without any barriers on whether that was graphic design or interior design or all these other silos. That one really spoke to me. And it's interesting thinking about this now because they're dead as a medium in a lot of ways, and
Right.
that's starting to create this backlash of there have been over the years, and it's becoming old news now. But a friend of mine years and years and years ago gave me I don't know, a copy edition or whatever of McSweeney's. Like, so McSweeney's creates these um, publications. I mean, but they're different every time. A hardcover book jacket,
Mm, yeah.
4 different individual books laid into a box, and you would subscribe to these. And some of the most like incredible like stories, culture, art, illustration, photography, like everything across the board was just so fantastic. And it makes me think about there's another one, I think it's called The Huntsman, I want to say, that I got as a gift a few years ago, which is
Hmm.
these outdoor enthusiast guys who are into, backcountry hunting and that kind of thing. And they're like, publish a magazine that's legit again, And so they've got like this best photographers and people following them. And you go through these layouts and it's just beautiful print in storytelling form, in a way that I don't care what the digital experience can give us beyond that. It's not the same experience. We're not
Yeah.
trying to replace one or the, it's just like, this is another form of human experience that involves a tactile, set of paper sheets in a way that then provides constraints for how you work as a designer to communicate a message. And I think there's always, I love watching I guess the medium shift, because you think back to like Spin Magazine or any of these other magazines, and it was just the
Hmm.
cheapest paper, the cheapest crap. Maybe you had
Oh,
some pretty
sure.
good design in it, but um, I love this sort of like, they almost feel like beautiful textbooks now and works of art
Hmm.
and, relics, like they mean something. There's a lot of value in them. And I don't know. Does this make us sound like old men? I have no idea. Like I think about the kid, like people when I was a kid who, like I remember,
Yeah.
and they're collecting like, nostalgic oil can signs or something in their garage. But like
Right.
maybe that's our version of this. But there's something about those that I still very much like.
Oh, there was Ray Gun too. I don't
Oh
think
yeah.
I ever owned a copy of that, but I had a buddy, my junior year of high school, that brought a edition of Ray Gun, and I didn't really, it was in these commercial design, graphic design classes, but again, most of what I was doing was like airbrush and like old school stuff. Even though I played around a little bit on the Mac, it was so slow and so primitive in the mid 90s that like you couldn't really do commercial work in photography and that kind of thing inside the computer at that level, short of like layout. But it was like this early David Carson work from Ray Gun magazine. And I think I remember it was like an article on Beck. It was like when that song Loser was big, and just kind of blew my mind, the things that was going on with the layout and the kind of playing with legibility and how the story flowed and how crazy and messy it was. It was just a really cool thing for a young creative to check out.
Oh man, people. First of all, it's a good thing we never made any promises to anybody about what this show is about. I think we said it wouldn't be a physics show. You put that
Right.
limitation on
We
me,
got that
so
far.
okay, fine. But yeah, I
It's
think
Schrodinger's podcast.
exactly that's
The
okay.
number of
I'm gonna
people who will get
write
that
that
joke.
down. Right. Shout out to the 4 people who are laughing right now because that's
Right.
funny. All right, so the context of this is, this is pre-internet for us. I mean, I tell the story about how I went to college at Ball State University, go Cards, and they had a great design. Yeah, that's right. They had a great design program back in the day, and all these wonderful new creative facilities and everything. It was a great school, really great program. And it was in a town that literally had no bookstore. And this is pre-internet. This is I mean, the internet existed, but this was pre like portfolio page, like you could go online and get a ton of visual, like an overload now of literal visual references as a designer, to the point that like you have to be careful of that, or you're just going to end up copying, from people.
Right.
There was no culture in this town. There was no bookstore in this town. We had to drive an hour and a half away to the nearest city when we wanted to go down to the bookstores to flip through all those magazines and books and, design books and portfolio books. And we couldn't afford them. So, and you couldn't take pictures with your phone, so, I mean, we were just going down every weekend that we could to check these out if there was, extra time, and then just make little notes and stuff, pool money together to buy them. We had subscriptions that we would, split for the magazines. That was all that we could get to our doors.
Right.
This is just a completely different world. And when you flipped open Ray Gun magazine for the first time and you saw type being used like that, this is also on the tail end, like you just said, where desktop publishing and all that stuff was something people talked about, was desktop publishing. You don't even hear that term anymore,
Right.
So it's really unique. It's really interesting in the way that like AI has been, holy crap, this is going to change a lot, right? That's kind of how our moment was back then, with the internet being able to even put images and things for designers to reference, collaborate, work together, talk together, build portfolio pages, all of that. So it was really revolutionary to us to see that kind of thing. And I sometimes, I do wonder what's that now? I think AI is that in a lot of ways now. I guess it's the access to it that's so ubiquitous that even then, the access to what we had, you had to still fight for it a little bit. I almost wonder, what's that thing we have to kind of fight for that not a lot of people have access to yet, that's going to change everything? I don't know what that is.
Yeah. And that, it's funny going back to one of our first episodes talking about the Apple goggles, and those things are like, the story has kind of gone away, but the goggles haven't even shipped yet.
You're right. Maybe that
So
is it.
It'll be interesting how that does or doesn't really make a huge splash when it actually hits and people are using them and people are working with those. And I really think, sort of like the iPhone, it's not that it made no noise on V1, but the iPhone 2, iPhone 3 is really where we started seeing adoption and some hockey stick growth, and really impacted. I don't think the App Store existed until phone 2 or 3, right?
It came later. I don't remember exactly when.
Yeah, it
It
was
certainly
definitely
wasn't common
later
for
in the
people.
process, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, and all of the, all of those nonsense apps that,
Do you remember the koi fish one?
yeah,
It was so calming though.
or the one where you tip it, it looks like you're drinking
Oh
something,
yeah,
or what?
of
Like, it
course.
was just like stupid, novel
They
things
made
that people were
millions.
kind of playing with how this was going to work. And this is like dawn of social media and all of that. But I think those goggles are going to be a big, uh, a, a big thing that people will fight for access to, and I think will make a big difference.
I think you're right. If I were to play off your brainstorm of which one that's going to be, I think you're right. And we talked about it in that episode quite a bit, that's the single biggest exciting platform shift that I've seen as a designer. And you just reminded me that, last week, maybe the last 2 weeks, kind of going the rounds on social media and Twitter, is the AR. So like if you take your iPhone, there's this person that's walking around this statue that they saw. It's like this copper maybe statue with patina on it or something like that. And they're walking around it, and the app is guiding them through how to move the, LiDAR and cameras sitting there measuring it all out almost to a T. And then it maps it. And now I have this object, and they're putting it in the augmented reality space and they're moving it. That was demonstrated quite a long time ago, but for some reason, like this
For sure.
kind of got popular again last week to remind people sort of, hey, this is where our world is going, and it's getting better and better and better. And we haven't even seen really the first hardware, adoptable hardware hit the market yet. And I think we said in that episode, and I know I feel this way for years now. I mean, it's going to change everything. It will absolutely change design and designers and how we think about it. It's going to change brands immensely and how we interface with each other. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. All the things that they have to work out to ultimately make it more perhaps fashionable and wearable. That's all that's not difficult. You see what needs to happen. Like, it's not like it's a mystery, of like, how do we get that to happen? Like, it's going to happen. So yeah, I think you're right, man. Let's put our pin on that one. I think that's a good one.
Yeah. And it's like, I remember years ago, Mythbusters doing an episode on I think it was on the Iron Man suit. Like, how could you make a suit that does any of the things that this thing does? And the reality was the scale just wasn't there. Like, there was no way to fit all that stuff into a thing and still look like you're a person walking around. Like, you need massive reservoir of fuel and all of these other things. And I think the VR AR thing has been sort of the same thing. Like, just the physical thing hasn't caught up to the concept of how well I think this is going to work in the future. And we're getting close.
Oh yeah. I mean, and again, like basically round one. I mean, basically.
Right.
So yeah, that's going to be interesting. You just wanted to work in a movie reference there, didn't you? I like how you did that. Or super sly. Most of you, for anyone who doesn't know, Josh loves movies. The last 2 movies I have seen was with Josh in 2007. And then my children, I did finally take to the latest Spider-Man months ago, whatever that was.
maybe not at my recommendation.
And I believe probably your recommendation.
It was good, right?
It was fantastic. It was wonderful. When I sit down and finally do watch movies, most of the time I'm like, this is incredible. Like, this is just wild. I just don't go to theaters, and I definitely don't spend a lot of time here doing them, but I probably should. So,
and I've resisted so many episodes talking about Oppenheimer, and I'm still going to resist because I really need to go. I need to figure out how to see it a second time. I've only seen it once. I saw it in IMAX in Denver, and I really wanted to see it on the film IMAX here in Indianapolis, and I just didn't get it done before they stopped showing it. So I'm hopeful when it comes to awards season that they'll bring it back to the IMAX for a minute, just to, rehash, and would love to see that.
I know this is your backhanded way of inviting me to see yet another movie. And we'll talk about it when the time comes, because I'm going to neither commit nor tell you no right now.
That's fine. That's fine.
So you're hilarious. Speaking of human connection and atomic bombs, that's a hard segue, brother. Back to human connection.
Here's where it works. Christopher Nolan films are a brand. Like, the way that he uses sound and imagery and the type of images that he gets, like, there's a lot of brand consistency in that. So then we can segue back to brand.
I see. So that's where your
explosive brain metaphor.
Okay. I wish I could keep up with the Nolan thing. I do know Nolan. I do understand, like, who is it? Anderson, Wes Anderson, right? How that's like there's like a joke now with the AI that makes the Wes Anderson, scenes and snippets or whatever. But you're right. That's another form of brand, right? I mean, that's another form of like, hey, this is the thing that is recognizable beyond just the initial creation or, movie in this set. And most of them don't do that. Like, we notice it because they stand out, which is a hallmark of branding, right? If you don't have differentiation and distinction, the ability to build value in your brand is, well, in that case, eliminated. You have to stand out, you have to be different, and you have to also be distinct. Those are kind of the first 2 cornerstones, which, this maybe we'll take a hard turn back into the brand strategic stuff here. I think that's another thing that's so difficult, because leadership they have to put a stake in the ground now. They have to say, I stand for this and I don't stand for that. We do this and we don't do that. We believe in this, we don't believe in that. That's very difficult for people to take those kind of risks and make those kind of claims, even though we see time and time and time again that that's what promotes brands to the top every single time. Tell me about, you mentioned Bold Brand 2.0, your book, which, hey, plug. This is just an episode of shout outs, man. Holy crap. So shout out to you, who I believe wrote kind of the definitive brand book for professional service firms. I mean, that's really the way I would categorize that book in particular, with tons and tons and tons of gems for anybody who's interested in brand, but certainly a staple on any of the bookshelves for people in that marketing space or that industry, in my opinion. Working with companies, in that space or any space, where do you see them sort of get resistant? Like, how far do you think a professional services firm who's, again, expecting, like you said earlier, to say, hey, but we still need to be clear that we build buildings, we still
Right.
need to be clear that we offer this. Where do you see them start to get resistant when you start to push them further and further out on that different/distinct limb?
Yeah, it's like kind of a twofold thing. And one of the big things is naming. Short history of every professional business ever is, Bob Miller puts his name on the sign, Miller Architects, and then he joins with Johnson, and then it's Miller and Johnson Architects, and then Johnson Jr. once, and then it's Miller, Johnson and Johnson. And then eventually they're like, it's too many names on the sign. Now it's just going to be MJJQ or whatever the latest last name they want to add. And then, but the problem is every other firm is an acronym firm at this point, or especially 5, 10 years ago, there were so many acronyms. Recently it's changed where there are a few more arbitrary names, arbitrary, like Apple is not a computer, but it's the name of the company. So like there are there's one called Populous, and it's like a design firm that specializes in event spaces and things where people gather. So it's a really cool, clever, interesting name. But so that's one of the areas in which there's so much historical momentum around how to name a professional services firm that a lot of principals still with these old school firms are like, I'm just holding on to my acronym, even if we are getting lost in the alphabet soup. And then I think there's also kind of the look and feel bit that is especially tricky for them to switch as well. So it's like anything that really sounds or looks different is where firms, I think, have the most resistance in being different than what everybody else is doing.
You kind of make me think about the idea of there is sort of a competing forces between brand equity.
Mm-hmm.
So equity in that name, equity in the things that have made that brand familiar to people over time, and the desire and need that you talked about earlier of quote unquote keeping it fresh, right, and
Right.
relevant. And this is where so I talk about positioning a lot, that we will see these exercises where people will say, you need to define your positioning, you need to manage your positioning, control your positioning, determine your positioning, whatever that is. And
Right.
I place positioning in the exact same context as I do with brand, which is that lives in the customer's mind. That does not live with you putting it down on a piece of paper and suddenly saying, this is our positioning. And I know that's going to offend a lot of people who've gone through positioning statement documents and practices, but before they despair, that doesn't mean we shouldn't go through those practices. We do set out with an intent. We do want to influence people in those particular places because mostly we have listened to those people. We understand what they want. We are reacting to their needs and making sure that we, meet and exceed what they want.
Mm-hmm.
But you do build up equity over time in these names. And I think a lot of those sort of like older leadership, this is one of the detriments that I think a lot of brand agencies have when they swoop in and it's all fresh and new. It's kind of like America entering World War II, after like the British are like, there's this really great Eddie Izzard clip about how, we just roll in and we're like, oh, Europe smells fresh in the morning. Isn't this wonderful? And like they're over there on their last leg. Like, where have you been? Right. The agencies kind of swoop in like that at times, and they don't have all that context of 40
Mm-hmm.
years of being Miller and Johnson Architects or whoever.
Yeah. Or even asking questions, just showing up and being
Yeah.
like, oh, branding, this is how we do it. Stamp, stamp, stamp.
Oh yeah. Oh, and
Right?
that's the
Like,
worst sin.
no
That how I
curiosity,
feel.
no, right.
That
Yeah,
is not
that's
branding.
super frustrating.
Absolutely. That is insanity because you're asking for a misalignment once again. And that's
Right.
really the key. And that's where I kind of go back to like, well, listen, is the leadership this or not? Until they see the competitive advantages of making sure that they stay on par with the positioning compared to everybody else. And that's why I brought positioning up is if you're one of 10 firms constantly bidding on projects and you're starting to lose bids at a rate that you never did before, and you study the other 9 firms and you realize every single one of them has stayed up on the latest trends. Every single one of them is speaking the latest language. Every single one of them appears and provides progressive and like new technologies
Mm-hmm.
to all of their solutions. You didn't change anything. So you could say, well, our positioning is still X. No, it's not. It changed. If the market changed, if anything about your competitive landscape, anything about the market, anything about the audience's perceptions changed, your positioning changes with it. It's alive. You can't
Yeah.
just rest on it. And yet you need to maintain it long enough for it to solidify, right? This is that, again, the equity has to arise over time, but we also still have to make sure that we nurture that living, breathing creature as we go.
Yeah, I think it's great that you brought that up, because I think that's definitely the number three. In fact, that's maybe the number two thing. So I think the name thing is where there's the most historical momentum. And to your point, the positioning, I think really the choosing something that is not just we do all the things as your positioning is probably the number two area of resistance, and the look and feel is probably three. But the idea, like you said, like the positioning is not just up to you. Your reputation, to use a different word, is really lives in the market's mind's eye. But you do get to influence it, and you do get to choose. If you say we do everything for everybody, you're not doing much to help narrow in what that reputation, or what that point of view, or what that positioning is going to be in the market's mind. And I think that's an area where especially professional services firms and other old school industries have a hard time saying we do X for Y, meaning we do this specific thing for this specific market. And it doesn't mean that's the only thing you do and the only group that you do it for. I mean, even in my instance, like I do brand strategy for AEC firms, but that's not my only client type. It's just my most common client type. So it's even been tough for me over the years to get down to saying that to the market out loud, because there's something scary about feeling like you're going to pigeonhole yourself, or like, oh, maybe I could go a little bit more narrow, but not all the way in. Maybe I just say broadly B2B, or maybe I just say broadly brand stuff, or and maybe it's marketing and branding, or maybe it's design. Maybe that's more broad. Maybe that scares fewer people away, but totally agree.
Yeah.
Like it's one of the toughest things for firms to get right.
Yeah, I totally agree, man. And that's often occurs, I think, in that nature of like service business, right? Like services, because
For sure.
I think most of them do care. Most of them do want to be able to solve problems, and they often find themselves in the position to solve tangential problems for people that are a little bit outside of maybe what they came to them originally for. Which I will remind you next time I'm holding a camera for you in one of your jobs and helping you with one of your projects. I'm going to turn to you and go, so is this brand strategy for AEC firms, Joshua?
Right.
So, and the answer, the real answer is, yeah, it is actually.
Yeah,
it is. It is actually that. It's really critical that I think that there's a doorway into a room, right? But the doorway is not the room. But if they don't walk through that doorway, they're never going into that room. So any of this sort of, well, and we do this and we do this isn't really a value proposition for most people, but when you have a customer who's been in that room, who comes out and says, look, we hired them to handle our initial brand strategic, our strategic brand direction, right? To pin that all down. And then by the end of it, they executed on everything, right? They did all of our campaign work. They did video work. They did social media, like they did all of it. It was so amazing to have somebody who tied that all together, right? Like that matters, that does resonate with people, but you can still stake your claim on that initial, doorway offer of like, well, this is still where our expertise is,
Yeah. Well, it's like the Blair Enns-ism that I recount in the book is his whole thing about the wedge. Like if you look at a triangle and you lead with the back side of it, with the big flat part, like it doesn't register for anyone. You're just sitting with a big wall of information. We do this and this and this and this and this.
That's right.
But if you lead with the pointy part, or as Blair calls it, the tip of the spear, the wedge, that's where you have the chance to like pierce somebody's attention.
Yes.
Lead with the one thing. One thing. And then you get the whole rest of the triangle to come into the room as you're talking about. And it doesn't mean that you can't talk about all the other things that you do and all the other things that you're really good at, skilled at, delivering the whole enchilada. But if you lead with, we do everything for everyone, nobody's going to remember what that is.
It's not distinct, and it's certainly not different. I love that he uses that concept at tip of the spear, because I use that all the time as well. And I forgot that he used it. Maybe he just refers to it as the wedge, but that's probably a less violent way of looking at it. I dig it. Shout out Blair.
Well, he's
also
Canadian.
and that's true.
He's sorry.
He's so awesome.
I love
so oh yeah, I mean another OG, right? I think I reflect on how many times you or you know, I or any of the people that we know who have gotten in the door with a good client to solve one acute specific problem, which for anybody out there listening, especially if they're trying to build up their reputation in their client base and they are capable of doing great work, that's, you know, in my opinion, great advice to people is offer one specific solution to one specific problem as small as possible to get that marketing director or CEO or whoever to say, okay, fine, I'll throw a couple grand at that budget and let's see what you can do. Like I would highly recommend to anybody to start with that and make that barrier of entry as low as humanly possible with one acute specific problem. Solve that problem for them and show them how great your results are and how you pulled through from them, and then ask them what's next. And then you keep building and expanding. And then you open the door to being able to share what is the problem that you actually solve for them. Like, what are the biggest problems you can take on? How can you give more solutions? Most people are looking, even at the professional level, like again, the giant, you know, Miller and Johnson architects or whatever, you know, they're looking for people who pull through for them. That's what the companies who hire them are looking for. We get caught up in the weeds so often of the actual tactical thing of like, we put up steel, concrete, and glass. Well,
Right.
do you do it on budget and on time and with workers who, you know, aren't going to file a million different claims or whatever their other problems are? Like, are you able to do that too? Because that's really critical, you know, and we get lost in these, like, again, I call them the commodities. You know, all of the different, well, I do, you know, copywriting. Well, that's cool. So does a million other people. Like, what is that? I don't care. Right? Like we need to talk a little bit more about my acute
But
and
it's
specific
grammatically
problems.
correct.
Well, that would, you know, that might narrow it a
Strangely
little.
today, that might be a unique
That actually
positioning.
is apparently an asset. So yeah, I think that again, that tip of the spear idea to get your foot in the door and get moving is so critical. And I don't think that just applies to solopreneurs and small businesses like us. I think that's also, you know, some massive companies who would love to have the lion's share of some of these, you know, incredibly large budgets. A lot of times what they need to do is prove themselves to that client, and you can do it on a much smaller scale with a lot lower risk for the client, and then prove yourself there and then, you know, grow up.
Yep, totally true. Well, speaking of proving ourselves there and then growing up, I think it's about time to land the plane on this one.
we better, or it's going to get off the rails real quick because I'm,
Wait,
I'm riding a
we haven't
razor
gotten
thin
off the
edge of
rails
coffee.
already?
Oh yeah. Mentally right now, I'm like, bro, we got to land this plane. Oh, there's so much to do. Yes. You know, again, I don't have any concluding thoughts on this other than I love that every episode we continue to kind of get a little more comfortable. I love, you know, we talked to all of our people who are actually following along. Love you. Shout out. Thank you
Yes.
again. Because it's freaking awesome. And, you know, for Josh and me, and I will speak for you, sir.
Well, thank you.
We love talking about this kind of stuff. We talk about this stuff together all the time, and we just kind of decided we need to share this, you know, with other people. And it gives us an excuse to sit down for an hour and talk about something that we really enjoy. And it's not always going to be pretty, and it's not always going to be great. And we kind of told ourselves we need about 20 episodes to maybe find the groove of what it is we actually do want to talk about. And Josh crossed physics off of my list, and I crossed movies off of his list, and we're compromising here.
We're trying to work it in anyhow, but
yeah, it's not going to stop either of us. But you know, it's so cool to be able to bring some of these things that, you know, you and I have sat across CEOs, you know, desks and boardroom tables to discuss at a high level for a lot of budget. And it's really cool to be able to, you know, sit down and unpack that for people. It's fun.
likewise. Well, let's do it again sometime.
Probably should.
All right, buddy.
brother.
Talk to you soon.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.